Okay, so I'm presenting the findings from my master's dissertation research. I've been doing my master's at the University of Edinburgh, and it's looking at demand for human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and looking at buyers of sex as one aspect that contributes to demand. I'm losing my voice a bit, so just put your hand up if you can't hear me throughout, and I'll try and keep it up. So just to give you some background about how I came into this. So in Scotland at the moment, there's new trafficking and exploitation legislation that's under consideration, and as part of this there's been some push to address demand for human trafficking, and as a part of this there's been calls to criminalise the purchase of sexual services. So the reason I'm really looking at trafficking for sexual exploitation is because in the push to look at demand for human trafficking and also serious organised crime, there sort of seemed to be a gap with traffic prostitution, and people weren't really discussing how to address demand for traffic prostitution, and the only method that was proposed was criminalising purchase. And so I'm not Scottish, I'm from New Zealand, and in New Zealand prostitution is decriminalised, and there's been an ongoing debate about the impact of that on human trafficking. So that's sort of how I came into this. So I'm calling them clients, like the buyers of sex, and I was looking at them as one aspect that contributes to demand, and the aim was to look at investigating the potential for involving clients in addressing trafficking and other forms of harm and prostitution. So I set out the following research questions. So how do clients perceive human trafficking and exploitation? How do they understand their role? And what are the policy implications for involving them in preventing trafficking and exploitation? So I used data from clients that was posted on prostitution advertising websites. So there's been a shift in recent years in the sex industry to advertising online, and most of these websites have a space where clients post a review of a sex worker that they've seen. So I took the 3 main advertising websites in Scotland, and I looked at just over 300 reviews. And what they do is they kind of give you a picture of what the client's expectations are for engaging in prostitution, what they see as good, what they see as bad, and it gives some indication of their behaviour and what influences their behaviour, because the reviews have a space on them where the clients say they would return to see the sex worker, or they would recommend them to someone else. So it kind of gives you more of an indication of what influences their behaviour rather than sort of chat room data or other online data from clients. So this is going on to the findings. So in relation to the first question, how do clients perceive trafficking and exploitation? So, probably unsurprisingly, there was very few references to trafficking and exploitation in the reviews. It was only referred to if it seemed really extreme or obvious, and where the clients did suspect it was happening, their suspicions were quite sort of easily dismissed. And I'll read you a quote. This is from one of the reviews. So, I've seen a different Romanian girl at the same flat in the past. Pimped, very possibly, but happy and relaxed, talking about trips to the shops and gym, so not exactly giving the impression that she's a chained to the bed trafficked girl. So you can kind of see there's a really high threshold for what they consider trafficking, and it kind of ties into the idea of Mina's presentation about the ideal victims. So in the reviews, from what they were saying, I could tell that they were coming into contact with women working in exploitative conditions, but they weren't interpreting it in this way. They were drawing on sort of a discourse of consumer norms to understand what they were seeing. So they were really concerned with a set of factors that made for a negative experience, and they called this a bad punt. So this was seeing a violent or a controlling pimp, the sex worker using drugs, having poor hygiene, or appearing unwilling. So sort of reading these things, to me they seem like indicators of exploitation. but the clients weren't interpreting it in this way. They were drawing on consumer norms to interpret what they were seeing, and they wanted to avoid these bad punts because they violated their consumer expectations, and they resulted in an unsafe or unsatisfactory experience. So one example for sex workers appearing unwilling, they responded to this with things like saying this isn't value for money, this is a poor service, because they expected the sex worker to appear like they were enjoying it as well. And they weren't, questioning why they were appearing unwilling. And things like with the poor hygiene, they would talk about this being poor value for money, poor service, and then they would sometimes go on to say it's because these women are run in, they called it conveyor belt operations, so seeing a lot of clients in a short period of time, but then they didn't go on to question why they were working in these conditions. And I'll just read some quotes. So they show how the sex worker appears unwilling, and one case where they're using drugs but it's interpreted as a poor service. So overall, for the money, she is attractive. You could see the pain in her eyes though, she does not like this job. No emotion to it. I wanted to complain about her attitude, but I'm kind of too nice. I really do think that she was drugged up. So you can see that it's about having the consumer experience that they want rather than, the ethics of sleeping with someone on drugs or questioning the unwillingness. So another main finding that came out was the importance of ethnicity for clients. So the clients came up with this ethnic hierarchy, and they had the most desirable sex workers were the white UK nationals, and then there was a sort of range of other ethnicities or nationalities, and then Eastern European, and in particular Romanian was the least desirable. And there was they spent a lot of time talking about Romanians. There was lots of long discussions about it, and I put it in quotations because I think that they spend a lot of time trying to figure out who's Romanian, who isn't, and I think that it's just a category that they've constructed and they're associating it with everything that's negative. So they associate this Romanian category with more likely to have pimps, being run in conveyor belt operations, so having poor hygiene and appearing unwilling. So when I was reading these, I found it it seemed like this was a group of women who were working under really sort of horrible exploitative conditions, but the clients really, they sort of held quite derogatory, harsh views towards these women. They often blamed them for their conditions, and they tolerated and sort of expected these exploitative conditions for this people they saw as Romanian. So I wanted to look at why Romanian in particular over any other group, and why they had such derogatory views. So I found that the focus on the Romanian group could be tied to media portrayals and political rhetoric around immigration in the UK. So Romania and Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007 with restrictions on their freedom of movement, and the restrictions were lifted in 2014. And around this time there was a lot of political debate and media coverage about immigration. So I looked at some studies that reviewed the media coverage, and these studies found that Romanians were presented as, the immigration was presented as a threat, so they used language like invasion and a flood. Romanian immigrants were portrayed as in relation to crime and poverty, whereas Bulgarians, who Bulgaria joined at the same time, they weren't associated in the media with crime and poverty. Romanians were also tied to Roma gypsies, and Roma and gypsy portrayals were tied to crime and poverty as well. So in the reviews, I found that these kind of media portrayals were filtering down into what the clients were saying. So I'll read some quotes to illustrate this. Nothing against Romanians, but the culture amongst these working girls is one of blatant dishonesty and deception. Romanians are on my blacklist. It's the Romanian Roma gypsies that are the big problem. so many rubbish Romanian prostitutes invading our shores. So you can see the same sort of media portrayals are filtering down into the client's perceptions. So the second thing I looked at was how do clients understand their roles and responsibilities, and basically they didn't see themselves as having any type of role in contributing to or facilitating trafficking or exploitation. So far I'd found these findings are pretty sort of depressing to go through, but the sort of one potential thing was that clients have this code of practice that they've constructed for themselves, and it's based on these consumer norms, and it guides them in avoiding these bad punts. And considering that these bad punts sort of align with exploitative conditions, it's sort of they're inadvertently avoiding them through their code of practice. So as a part of their code, they're sort of charged with acting as responsible consumers. So they're held responsible for doing their research on the online ads and looking for the signs of bad punts. They call them the signs. And they're responsible for leaving sort of unsafe or awkward situations, and they criticise each other for not doing these things. And they also quite often sort of lament not having more information to help them avoid these situations. And when they do their research looking at the online ads, they show some sort of skill in detecting these situations. They look at the language used, the pictures and the phone numbers in the ads, and they're trying to detect whether the person is an independent sex worker or whether they're sort of being organised by a pimp or somebody else. And interestingly, that same method is used by the police in Scotland when they're trying to detect trafficking networks or looking for sort of unsafe practices. So they show motivation and some skill in avoiding these bad punts, and they're asking for more information. So as it aligns with exploitative conditions, they're sort of charging themselves or holding themselves responsible in a way for avoiding these situations. So that goes on to the policy implications. I think the client responsibilities it shows that there's some potential to responsibilise the clients in Scotland by legitimising and building on their consumer code. However, it really it really depends on what the legal status of prostitution is. And that's, I know there's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into consideration with the legal status, but these findings sort of support that from a client perspective. If you had some form of legalisation, you could use clients to detect and report these exploitative situations, and also use it to expand the code that they've already constructed. So it seemed like they were sort of operating in this sort of hidden, stigmatised environment, and they'd come up with their own code that they based on consumer norms, but if it was sort of legalised, it would be expanded to afford more rights to sex workers as would be afforded in other legitimate industries. The tolerance for the poor working conditions for migrant workers, that's really problematic because it sort of just facilitates trafficking and facilitates exploitation. But the specific focus on Romanians, it gives a bit of a insight into how the political rhetoric and media portrayals are sort of coming down and affecting the client's perceptions, and then in turn the conditions that these people are working in. So the policy implications of that is that there's some role for political actors in protecting workers' rights, and by using language that sort of promotes tolerance for exploitation, that will likely to be undermining any anti-trafficking efforts that they have at the same time. So in conclusion, there's potential for a role for clients in Scotland. And there's also the need for a role of the political actors to promote migrant workers' rights. And finally, I would say more research is needed into how the interactions between the political rhetoric, the media portrayals and public perceptions, and how they affect migrants' working conditions. And that should sort of tell us more about what the role of the state and the role of the public should be in addressing exploitative conditions. So references. And thanks for listening.
Again, very interesting presentation. I'm sure it raised some ideas and questions. Yeah.
That's very interesting, thank you. I mean, you think about online reviews of restaurants and hotels and vacuum cleaners, but now we're seeing the emergence of online reviews of other human beings about what they might be like as a potential business partner, and were they rude, and this, for example, where sex workers and a lot of private and personal information. Can you just describe a little bit about the editorial process of those reviews, and if there is such an editorial process, and who controls that? So in what way is it editorialised or censored in a way?
Yeah, well, it's different depending on the website. So I looked at 3 different websites, and 2 of them were quite sort of, you could tell they were more strictly controlled, and so the advertisers, the people who ran the website would, I think they would check the reviews, and they had a set format that they wanted to put up, and they had certain rules, like they weren't meant to be sort of explicit discussions about what happened, and then there was another website that there was a web host, but you could tell that it wasn't really monitored to the same extent, and that's on that site you would get a lot of, like, people were being more blatantly sort of racist, and there was some misogynist comments, and so you could tell that one wasn't really that regulated. I think that the ones that were regulated, I think that the web owners have they're motivated to review the reviews and make sure that there's, I suspect that they probably don't want people to be talking about trafficking and exploitation, because there was the case in the US with I think it was, I can't remember what it was called, but they had one big classified online ad agency, and they found that they had been putting up ads for trafficked minors, and then as a result, they had to have all their advertising for sex work for the sex industry shut down, and that was sort of a big revenue maker for them. So I think that the web hosts have some kind of motivation to look at what they're doing and make sure there's nothing in there.
Craigslist.
Yeah, Craigslist. Yeah, that was the one. Yeah.
Yes, Marie, and then.
My first point picks up on your point, because just as with restaurant reviews, the big challenge is knowing whether people have actually eaten in the restaurant or if they represent a competing brand. And I've sat down with Estonian women filling out reviews on other women to beat the competition. So my first question is how you might handle methodologically, but also epistemologically, the fact that you don't know if this person is a client. It can be a man or a woman that is not selling sex, but that have some enjoyment out of writing reviews, or they might be Estonians trying to beat the Romanians. So that's my first point. My second is just a comment on how this interesting way of branding in the prostitution market, a positive and negative branding, and that some nationalities gets to stand for a particular line of work, kind of line of prostitution. Like I've experienced with Estonians who say they are Russians because Russian has been such an established brand, and Western Europeans, now Western African women call themselves Nigerian, etc. So it's very interesting how and what decides what comes to mean something negative, like Romanian, or something positive, like Russian, in the prostitution market. So that's just a comment on that's a very interesting thing that I hope you will elaborate on.
Yeah.
Is identification of the brands and how that can be linked to the public debate. And my third point is on this prospect of responsibilization. Because in Norway, the government established an online forum where clients in prostitution could chat in order to responsibilize them as consumers. to help them to bring out, thinking that if they have someone to talk to, they can establish norms and stuff. But with the criminalization of buying sex in 2009, this thing was shut down because the two perspectives, that the customer as the client of prostitution as a consumer and the client of prostitution as someone who is part of the problem and performs violence through the act of prostitution wasn't possible to combine.
Yeah.
So it's also the kind of how the construction of the client influences in what ways he or she can be responsibilized by chatting and finding norms, or what, with a criminal justice approach as not combinable in this case. So just these 3 points or comments.
Yeah, I think, and they sort of, from talking to the police in Scotland, they seem to think that the clients will become criminalised, and they sort of saw that as a real problem because then they won't have, like, they like to have access to what the clients are saying on these online forums, and they like to, I don't know, to have it out in the open. But I think, I don't know, I was sort of thinking of basic harm reduction and the most practical way that you could do it, and there's a lot of things out there about we need to educate clients to think in this way, to think about exploitation and human rights rather than consumer experience. But I just think that the consumer norms seem to be so sort of powerful, and there's all these cases of obvious person wasn't willing, or there was a violent pimp, but then they would always draw on these consumer norms, and it was sort of like they were using it to neutralise what they were doing or block it out. So I think I think it might be a sort of a practical way to do it, is to responsibilise them, even though it's not ideal. And I don't know if that answers your last one, but so the control, so the reviews, not knowing who's actually writing the reviews, that was one of the limitations. And I looked at there was some research by Sanders who'd also looked at reviews, and she was sort of treating them as constructions coming from clients rather than sex workers, and not necessarily being truthful. But I guess my thinking is if they come from sex workers or clients, they're sort of constructions of what to expect in relation to prostitution, and they're being used and seen by a lot of people. So I thought it was worth looking at them from that perspective. And so there was two of the websites were the two really monitored ones, or the ones that seemed quite sort of sanitised and regulated. They sort of I think that those ones were sort of seen as not so genuine, and then there was this other website that had a lot of data in it from Scottish clients, and it really did seem quite sort of genuine, because they spent a lot of time complaining about, these other websites. They're not, like, we still use them, but they're not always, we suspect that it's a pimp or a sex worker writing the reviews, and then they'd sort of get into these little fights amongst themselves, saying, who posted this, who was this genuine and stuff. So I sort of, I think there was some genuineness in them, but
Yes, I could just have a quick follow-up, because also a kind of methodological problem. When we analyse the content of this sex trade, Sunniva did this, it's the Norwegian website for clients. When we looked at the IP addresses, we didn't have it, but we could check how many. So it turned out that one person had written over half of the reviews. So it wasn't really a representation, and with different names, but with the same IP address. So it wasn't really a case of hundreds of clients having this experience. It was one person who dominated the forum. So it's also knowing whether this is kind of a general, that Scottish men had this consumer approach when they disregard signs of trafficking, or it's just one crazy guy who has nothing to do. That's also a methodological and epistemological challenge.
It is really sort of, it's limited into how much you can take from it.
But anyway, it's taking part in the kind of a public discourse, and many people are reading.
But it's not the representation of how people are as clients, and what they disregard as clients in terms of signs of trafficking.
It's different with the like the epistemological position is different than what you But still,
I agree, it's very interesting in itself.
yeah, and it's read by many people, and it produces reality in that sense.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not a representation of these clients. But we had another comment.
So in 2009, which seems like a long time ago now, my colleague and I wrote both online advertisements and reviews and international websites. And back then, it seemed one of the struggles that we had was there was a lot of code that was used that we were trying to navigate. So it was code that seemed to be specific to sex workers and clients, and so we had to spend some time deciphering what that code meant, because it was sort of the perception was you're reading this review as a client, then you understand that she gives good GFE, means girlfriend experience. And that was one of the most common themes that we found in all of these advertisements and reviews, was that their criterion for whether or not it was a good experience was based on the GFE, girlfriend experience, which was much more than a sexual transaction. So my question was just if you had code like that, or if you had any mention of GFE or anything like that in reviews.
Yeah, there was a lot of that was like a main thing for them in the positive reviews, that came out in the sort of in the sort of their bad punts. They wanted to avoid people who they didn't think appeared willing and they didn't think gave the girlfriend experience. Yeah, so there was a lot of that, and also there was quite a lot of I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what they were saying, and things like they talked about EE girls, and it took me a long time to figure out that was Eastern European, which seems obvious, but there's a lot of that.
Thanks. I think this question that Marlene raised about one person dominating the discussion board in Norway comes back to this whole kind of, there's a broader discussion about these trolls who kind of dominate any basically media discussion. So I don't think that sex ads are in any way kind of immune from that general kind of just the people's willingness or interest in just kind of provoking on different websites. But my other question was, I was really interested when you just mentioned that there was somebody, especially in relation to this ethnic hierarchy of these rubbish Romanian prostitutes invading our shores. I thought that was really interesting, because it kind of combines so many things that in a way, it's, I don't know, I can't really phrase this, but it just kind of raised a lot of like contradictions in this sentence. In a way that there's immigration, the immigrants who are coming here to take our, women and money and everything. But this is in a way contradictory, because it's like invading our shores, and yet they're kind of exploiting them. Yeah, I know what you mean, and they're sort of using them for this service and exploiting them, but also, there was a lot of, I don't know, it was quite hard to understand these clients. Like they were, a lot of I didn't put in some of the really sort of harsher things I was saying, but there was a lot of really harsh comments and really sort of derogatory and racist comments about Romanians, and yet at the same time they were still going to see these Romanian women, but then, I don't know, blaming them for not having the service that they expected, and really using ethnicity as a marker for what they wanted to avoid. So a lot of times saying never go to a Romanian, like never do that.
It was interesting how you showed that this public discourse is taken as part of these comments, like in terms of Romanians, that it's discussed more also in public, and now it's in the accounts of these clients.
Was it, you mentioned the Roma or the Gypsies, but it wasn't specifically the Roma, the Romanian Roma, or was it like Romanians in general? Were you able to distinguish between?
It was the clients were mostly talking about Romanian, like they said Romanian, and then there was some people talked about Roma and Gypsies in particular. So I think it kind of tied into their negative, like the prejudice about the Romanian group. But it was mostly like Romanian national.
Yeah.